Well, here's the theory, according to Marx. And he lays this out in his seminal work, The Communist Manifesto, in 1848. And he's writing, right in the heart of industrial capitalism and free market structure in the United States. He's a German philosopher, and he is actually a historian as well. And he writes this with his partner, Friedrich Engels, his intellectual partner, Friedrich Engels. And again, this is his literal manifesto on what his communist theory will be and what it will look like. So it helps to kind of explain what motivates Karl Marx. And we have to start with Karl Marx's view of history. I'll let you read the quote there, but Marx basically sees history as motivated by class struggle. It's conflict, according to Marx. Marx says that history only moves forward. We only have progress when we have conflict. He says conflict is what pushes society forward. But he says that if we go back and we look, conflict is always and everywhere the product of class struggles. Some struggle between the haves and the have-nots in society. And Marx gives a name for these people. He says under capitalism, we see a larger division than we otherwise would between the haves and the have-nots. And the rich, the capitalists, the ones who own the productive resources, so think of the factory owners here, they're what he calls the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie are the ruling class, and Marx would say that with the ownership of property comes power and control over the other class, which he identifies as being the proletariat, or the working class. And he says that the working class are almost slaves to their bosses, their employers, their factory owners. And so he sees that in capitalist societies, this division between the bourgeoisie, the haves, and the proletariat, the have-nots, is going to eventually lead to some conflict that will kind of sow its own seeds to a revolution. And he says that communism, and I quote, is the riddle of history solved, and it knows itself to be this solution. So somehow Marx theorizes that communism is going to be the end of struggle. And this makes sense. If communism sets out to achieve its goal, then we're going to see the eventual elimination of classes, which he sees as the source of all conflict. And Marx is famous for saying the very last line in his Communist Manifesto is, and I quote, "Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Workers of the world, unite." So Marx is actually calling for a rather bloody revolution here in the Communist Manifesto. And he says that the proletariat are eventually going to get tired of being sick and tired, and they're going to rise up together, and they're going to overthrow the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, and the factory owners, and they're going to take control. And when they do this, this control is going to be communal. No one person is going to own it. It's going to be shared by the whole proletariat. The bourgeoisie will be brought down to where the proletariat are. They will become a part of that, and we will eventually have one strong middle class. Another quote from Marx, which kind of brings out exactly what he means by this workers of the world unite. He says, and I quote, "There is only one way in which the murderous death agonies of the old society, capitalism, and the bloody birth throes of the new society, communism, can be shortened, simplified, and concentrated. And that way is revolutionary terror," emphasis on the terror part. So Marx is not a nonviolent, peaceful protest type guy. He is definitely somebody who is talking about a violent overthrow of property owners in a capitalist society. I can't stress enough how much property and the ownership of the factors of production is bound up in Marx's theory on communism. So I think it's appropriate to pause here for a second and really compare and contrast the two thinkers associated with the two theories that we've talked about, capitalism on the one hand and communism on the other. Now, if you remember, Adam Smith, in his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1758, made the claim, and I think it's a hard one to argue, that humans are by their very nature self-interested. It's important to know that Marx does not disagree with this. He says, yes, humans are by their very nature self-interested. This is an important foundational step for these two thinkers. Smith is going to say that, listen, because humans are self-interested, property rights are necessary. Property rights are what enable people to pursue their self-interest. If I can acquire property, a home, for instance, or a car, or a phone, or whatever it may be, I'm appealing to my self-interest overall. Again, Marx says he agrees that property rights do certainly enable people to pursue their self-interests and to be better off as a result. But this is where the agreement really ends between these two thinkers. Where they go from here really branches out. Marx sees the pursuit of self-interest very differently than Smith does. Smith sees the pursuit of interest in his invisible hand as being cooperative. So think about this. When people pursue their separate interests, they're led by the invisible hand to benefit society as a whole, even though it was no part of their original intention. He sees this as being cooperative in nature, so therefore we should certainly have more of it. If markets bring people together peacefully and lead to exchanges, and those exchanges leave both people better off, and private property is the mechanism for doing that, then we need to have more of it. Marx, though, says that the pursuit of self-interest does not lead to cooperation. He says it leads to exploitation. When people, according to Marx, pursue their separate interests, what happens is that some acquire more property than others, and they use this to exploit those who have less property. So think of the bourgeoisie exploiting the work and the labor and the surplus value, Marx says, of the worker, of the proletariat. Now think about this. The natural conclusion from these two is to say that Smith thinks we should protect and promote private property as an institution if private property leads to cooperation and self-interested individuals being better off. Marx, on the other hand, it makes sense why he wants to abolish private property if he sees private property as the linchpin of this exploitation. I want to now take a minute and use this to transition between what Marx says has to be a transition between capitalism and communism. And I'm going to read you this quote here, so bear with me. Marx says in one of his earlier writings that between capitalist and communist society, there lies the period of revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. Emphasis on transformation. Corresponding to this is a political transition period in which the state, or the government, can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. So Marx is saying something interesting here. He's saying that if we're going to go between capitalist and communist society, there has to be a revolutionary transformation from one to the other. And this requires what he calls a political transition period. So according to Marx, the political transition period is going to require the state. So in order to go from an economic system where property is the institution which governs society to communism, where there is no property rights whatsoever and no government whatsoever, there has to be some transition between them. So Marx lays out in the Communist Manifesto a 10-point transition plan. First of all, these are all things that the government in a socialist economic system, socialism is the transition period between the two. It's the government that needs to take away property from the bourgeoisie and accumulate that, concentrate that in the state. They need a heavily progressive income tax to redistribute wealth from the factory-owning rich bourgeoisie to the proletariat. They need to abolish inheritance so that the rich can't leave their wealth to their family. They need to confiscate property of immigrants. They need to centralize credit by means of a national bank So the bourgeoisie didn't only own factories, they owned the banking system. And so according to a communist, we should decentralize wealth out of the hands of banks into the government bank. We need to centralize or nationalize or bring under government control transportation, production, cultivation. Those need to be done with a social plan. This is the central planning element. All things are produced according to some government plan in a command economy. There is an obligation of all labor, according to Marx, especially for agriculture. Marx thinks that industry is secondary and agriculture should be emphasized and primary. And we should also combine, for one sole purpose, agriculture and industry. Bring them together for the being of the state. And finally, we need to have free public education for all children to educate them in the merits of a communist society. We need to instill in them the virtues that will be necessary to live in this communist utopia that Marx and Engels have predicted. We bring all of these under one plan. So remember, command economy, central planning, here's the plan. And then we take this plan, and Marx says, I think interestingly, that when class distinctions have disappeared, that is, when you can't tell a rich man from a poor man in society, and all the production, that is, the productive resources that make the stuff that satisfy our desires, is in the hands of associated individuals, that is, government officials, the public power will lose its political character. In other words, once this plan is realized, we no longer need a socialist government. We no longer need a state to do these things once the state has done its job. So according to Marx, socialism has a job to do. There is a definite end to that. And once the socialist dictatorial government achieves that end, they need to relinquish power and essentially return all property to the rightful owners, which is the people. So remember, according to Marx, this should be a familiar slide right here. We've got the continuum from capitalism to communism, with socialism situated in the middle. Remember, that's the political transition between these two. So we get rid of capitalism by using the socialist system. The government takes property, distributes property, provides education, basic resources. Now here is the transition. Watch. Individuals, property, and power is all supposed to transfer across this bridge. I want you to think of socialism as a bridge, and this 10-point plan as the bridge between the less than ideal situation, socialism, and the ideal, which is communism. Once that happens, once the 10-point plan is in place, notice there the graphic that the government is supposed to fade away and it's supposed to, quote, lose its political character. Okay, so we've got Marx's theory down. We know what communism is, we know how it differs from socialism, and we know that socialism is supposed to be the transitionary period. Socialism is the way to get us out of a capitalist society into this communist utopia. So here's the natural next question. Has this recipe been applied anywhere in real life? Have we had Marx's predictions and theories and 10-point plan that he predicted? Have we had that instituted? We'll talk about that in the next video.